Chapter 12. Powell paced back and forth in the hold of the cargo ship, his movements quick and nervous. There were 168 civilian terraformers, he said. Men, women, children. Spears gave them to the aliens. The air plant is automatic at this stage, you see, so the people were redundant. Wilks found that he was standing, his fists clenched. Powell stopped pacing, turned and faced the sergeant. You let him do it. I'm not a murderer, Powell said. Not even Spears. I saw you reach for that pistol you carry when you got here, Wilks said. But I didn't pull it. I would, I suppose, if I truly thought my own life was in jeopardy. And you don't think it is? What the hell do you need? A formal declaration of war? Powell chewed on that for a second. Listen, he said. I joined the service to do my duty for my planet. I was studying for the priesthood at the time. I planned to finish my training and become a chaplain. It didn't work out. I got sidetracked. So I wound up here. What Spears has done sickens me. But the path to the light is not by creating more darkness. Wilks stared at the man. He'd run into guys like Powell before. The military had to have a certain number of medics and religious types. Their bent, because of what they did or who they were before they ever joined up, was usually pacifistic. If you were wounded in battle, you needed somebody to staple you back together, so a surgeon. If you were emotionally burned out, some kind of counselor. Though Wilks himself hadn't ever had much use for those, psychologists or faithers. They were necessary, but you didn't want one next to you when the grill flamed on and the other side started shooting. And you didn't want one in charge when your ass was on the line. It wasn't that way with all of them. Wilks had seen medics who would just as soon carve your heart out as smile at you, and men of various gods who would cheerfully burn a stadium full of small children if they thought that's what their deity wanted. But Powell wasn't one of those. And given the situation, that was bad news. So what did the man want? Why was he telling Wilks all this? Abruptly, it dawned on Wilks exactly why. Powell was one of those who bought his meat flash-wrapped at the market, or pretended it was Soypro, but still ate it. He wasn't a hunter himself, but he wasn't above enjoying the taste of game, once it had been sanitized and neatly packaged. Once the thing had been gutted and the blood drained. He would eat it, but he wouldn't hunt and kill it. And he at least knew a hunter when he saw one. Wilks nodded to himself. Fine. He could live with that. He was used to doing the dirty work himself. The queen was a giant, bigger than other queens. A force of nature, unstoppable, irresistible, like something from an ancient mythos. She was the destroyer of worlds. She was the eater of souls. It was foolish to even think of resisting her. The queen loomed large 4 sets of inner jaws, opening and extruding like a Chinese puzzle box, able to spear and eat anything from mice to elephants. But she wasn't interested in mice or elephants. She wanted other prey. She wanted... Billie turned to run, but her feet were mired to the floor. She struggled and could only manage a glacial slow motion, as if she were shod in lead boots, as if she were on the bottom of a deep pool full of thick syrup. She cried out, kept trying to run, but it was hopeless. She could smell the queen as she drew closer. The sharp, bitter, burned plastic odor of her flowed out in waves to envelop Billie. The stench of bodies arot for years in some dead and fishless sea curled over Billie. A pustulent and blackened breaker with bloody red foam about to crash down.
Do not be afraid,
the queen said. Her voice was soothing, a melody from childhood, the tones of a mother comforting a frightened baby.
I love you. I want you. I need you.
No! Billie screamed. She'd heard it before. She knew it was a lie. She struggled to move in her personal amber, a prehistoric fly waiting for the hand of death, a doomed insect waiting for eternity to smother her.
I love you. Come, let me touch you.
A cold claw gripped Billie's shoulder.
No! Take it easy,
the tech said. He stood next to her, his hands on her shoulder.
It's okay. You're just dreaming.
Billie blinked, trying to make the transition from there to here. I know how it is, the tech said. I dream about her too. Billie stared, unable to bring up words. Tell the medics. They've got some stuff that helps. Nothing helps, Billie said. I've been dealing with this since I was 10. It's only a matter of time until the dreams finally come true. Outside the comm room, there came a sound as if someone were thumping down the hallway on metal boots. Billie was sure she knew exactly who it was. Ah, shit. What was she going to do about Mitch? Even as pissed as she'd been when they fought, she still felt that pull, that energy. Fuck. Call it what it was. That love. Damn. As they were leaving the complex, Spears took a short detour through one of the newer egg chambers. A mere dozen eggs rested here on the alien-constructed floor, all fairly fresh, only a couple of days old. He had surveillance gear everywhere. He knew there was no danger of these units hatching anytime soon. Plus, the doors, left open deliberately so the drones could move the eggs unimpeded, still worked. He had a trooper crank the doors shut, so he could be in the room for a few moments without interruption from nervous drone egg tenders. He liked to do this, visit the eggs. The rubbery, fleshy shells with the flower petal lips still clenched tightly together, protecting their precious cargo. They touched something in Spears. He was not a man given to deep introspection, no navel picker to worry over the unchangeable past or unborn future. He was a doer, not a ponderer. Still, there was a cold and merciless beauty to be found here. These were unborn warriors, out of the greatest warriors man had ever met. And Spears was a man of war. With 2 guards standing nervously alert, Spears walked to the nearest egg, squatted, put one hand out to feel the roughness of the living container. You could drop this little closed barrel off a tall building in standard G, and it would bounce like a plastic ball without damaging the tiny occupant. Spears knew because he had done it. In the variable gravity room the scientist had built, they'd done more than a few such experiments. The eggs were tough. Even under 3 Gs, they still maintained their integrity. They could be cut, were the knife sharp enough, but the wielder had best be very quick. Piercing the outer wall of an egg would get the cutter a face full of acid spray even more potent than that in the grown creature's blood. Nature had been lavish in her protection of the aliens' birth packaging. And the first-stage babies were hardy little devils, too. Spears grinned, stroked the egg as if it were the head of a faithful dog. The alien queens could reproduce in a kind of modified parthenogenesis, and the drones were mostly neuters. There were some males, the labos had found a few, and indications were that there could be a battle-like sexual intercourse between the 2 sexes. The available males, when they reached some critical number, fought each other to the death, leaving only a single survivor, who then lay claim to the queen. She made him work for it, slammed him all over the place. And if he survived this battering, worse than the fights with the other males, the queen would submit to his advances. The male's triumph would be short-lived. Within seconds after his hard contested mating was consummated, the queen would kill the hapless male. The scientists babbled on about genetic diversity and such, but it didn't matter. If there weren't any males around, the queen could do it herself. And if there weren't any queens around, one of the drones would undergo what the scientists called a hormone storm. When it was done, the drone would be a queen. Spears shook his head. Goddamned efficient bastards. Just what a commander in the field needed. You could hatch your own army in a few months, and as long as one of them stayed alive, you could start over again when those got killed. The troopers moved around. Spears could feel their fear. He grinned again, partly because he knew they were scared, and he wasn't. Partly because growing down his uniform pants leg was a fairly solid erection. As long as he squatted here, stroking the egg, it didn't show. He chuckled at his own hormone storm. That didn't happen much anymore. He'd managed to sublimate his sexual drives into more important things, but the little head did rear now and again. Not that he found sex unpleasant, no, that wasn't the problem. Just that it took too much time and energy to indulge in it these days. Of course, when he'd been younger, he thought he would live forever, and he would fuck anything with a hole and a pulse, and even the latter wasn't strictly necessary. And he'd learned something from the very first time he'd ever done it. Something very important. He laughed at the memory. Ah, Gunnery Sergeant Brandywine. Whatever happened to her? Colonial Marine Cadet Spears at 15 was still 2 years away from his first hitch, though he'd already gotten 3 core tattoos. Gunny Brandywine was his small arms instructor. She was probably twice his age, tough as a boot sole, and could drill the eye out of a ship rat at 20 paces with a carbine or a handgun. You pick which eye. She wore her black hair chopped short in a spacer's buzz, had a rangy, tight frame, flat pectoral muscles, and no breasts to speak of. And abs Spears would die to have himself. A lean, mean, fighting machine, Gunny was. A strong and deadly female. He'd watched her in the showers a couple of times, carefully keeping his back turned so she wouldn't see the short arm salute she was causing. Christ, he was so hard sometimes it stood nearly straight up. He didn't think she'd noticed, but one afternoon, after a session in the gym with the auto boxer, he'd found himself alone in the shower with her. As usual, his dick was trying to go ballistic, and he kept fiddling with the water's temp control, as if it were malfunctioning, so he could keep his erection out of her sight. She shut her shower off and started to leave. Good. But her footsteps on the wet plastic tiles went the wrong way. He could see her peripherally when she reached out and slapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, cadet. You might as well learn how to use that." Spears thought of himself as a Marine already. Tough, unflappable, cool under stress, but he felt himself go red. "Excuse me?" "You've been wanting to stick that in me for weeks, kid. In my quarters. 5 minutes. You can give it a shot." She turned and padded away. He watched the muscular roll of her buttocks, unable to breathe, he was so scared. But it had been fine. Gunny was practiced. She had obviously broken in more than a few first-timers, and she was patient. The first round took maybe 3 seconds until he discharged his weapon. 5 strokes, no more. It was great, but he knew enough to realize it hadn't done anything for her. He started to apologize. "Oh, man, I'm sorry, Forget it, cadet. I know how you young guys are. Besides, that didn't even take the edge off you. Here, give me that." The next 3 hours were a wonder to Cadet Spears. Sure, he had beat off plenty, but it didn't feel anywhere close to as good as what Gunny Brandywine taught him that afternoon. Amazing things. In the end, the most useful thing of all was patience. He was a hotshot cadet, always rushing, always in a hurry. Like life was a race he had to finish first. He couldn't wait to be on active duty. Gunny taught him how to wait. They were on her bed, reconnected for the 5th time. She on her back, one leg drawn up, foot hooked over his ass. He on his side, pumping fast. "Slow down, mister." "Huh?" She reached out, caught his hip with one hand, slowed his movement. When you're on the handgun range and you get an in-your-face pop-up target, what do? Point shoot, triple tap, 2 in the heart, 1 in the head, Spears said, as if he were in class, which, he realized much later, he was. Right, slow will get you killed in that combat sit, but if you get a pop-up at 50 meters, do you react the same way? He continued his motion at the speed she had set. No, ma'am, he said. You take deliberate aim, using your sights, and squeeze off 2 to the torso. Ah, that feels good. She grinned, looked at him, raised her legs so her toes pointed at the ceiling. Now back in the combat scenario. Explain your actions. Point shooting isn't accurate at long range. Accuracy is more important than speed in that situation. Shoot too fast and miss. The enemy might not. Better to be slow and certain. Push a little harder now, and a little faster. She bent her knee, brought it down close to her face. Good. Put your fingers here. Rub this way. He was getting close again, but he forced himself to hold his pacing where she wanted it. Life is like the range, cadet. There's a time to hurry and a time to go slow. Learning when to do the right thing at the right time is as important as anything you'll ever learn. You got that? He nodded, drawing close to his release yet again. He would have agreed with anything she said, but on some level, he did understand the lesson. It was a unique teaching method. Now you go fast. Move, cadet, move. He obeyed. It was one hell of a teaching method. Spears came back to himself, patted the egg, and stood. His sexual excitement cooled. A less patient man than himself might have missed this whole opportunity to develop an invincible army. If Gunny Brandywine were still alive, she'd be a crone, pushing 80 easy, but it would be interesting to see her, to show her how well her lesson had taken. And what the hell, maybe to fuck her once for old time's sake. Let's move out, Marines. He wouldn't have to tell these men that twice.